One at the time, big story this morning. Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes is set to be sentenced for defrauding investors.
Yeah, she was convicted by a jury in January.
In the last couple of minutes, you had a federal judge sentencing Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos to more than a decade in prison.
What a day.
Yeah, I mean, the emotions in there are just so raw. Everyone got silent in the courtroom. The judge gave kind of a long speech about how fraud is not an excuse for what goes on here in Silicon Valley. He sentenced her again to slightly more than 11 years. We are just about to get the surrender date, so she will not be taken to prison right now. But everyone just was silent after.
You did such a good job of setting the scene and letting us know, like, kind of the emotion. But a tweet doesn't speak,
Of course not.
the volumes that you can. And to see that she was on the stand and she was crying and really kind of begging for forgiveness.
Yeah, she did get her chance to speak. And again, we had seen her speak during the trial, and she was quite compelling and at times emotional. She got up today, gave a much shorter talk, apologizing, very contrite to her investors, to her family, to her employees, saying she realized she did things wrong. I don't think it swayed the judge. 11 years seems like something kind of on the high side from what I've been hearing from lawyers and legal analysts. But yeah, it was very emotional and very quiet when she finally got her chance to speak. And even before she spoke, the father of Tyler Schultz and the son of George Schultz, who was the investor, Tyler Schultz, the whistleblower, spoke looking directly at Elizabeth Holmes and saying, among the more cutting comments was, "You've heard a lot about Sunny Balwani being the bad guy. Elizabeth, you were the Sunny Balwani to my family." And he said that through tears, too. So this was a case, a trial that...
So this is slightly more than 11 years. Elizabeth Holmes has been sentenced to 135 months imprisonment for fraud. 135 months is just over 11 years. The guided range given by the judge based on the charges she was found guilty of, based on the guidance from prosecutors, was 11 to 14 years. So this is at the lower end of the stated range. Remember, Caroline, prosecutors had asked for 15 years. The defense team had asked for 18 months or at-home imprisonment, or being confined to home instead of being in prison. But this, and there's the redhead crossing the Bloomberg terminal, is official now. Elizabeth Holmes sentenced to 135 months for the fraud relating to Theranos, which is just little more than 11 years.
I think that was really powerful, because a lot of people were saying, oh, so she defrauded rich people. Rich people parted with their money willingly, and they should have known better. But to hear that this young man, this whistleblower, really suffered that consequence and really created a rift in the family, too.
It really did. The father spoke about how that rift was caused from grandfather to him, to his son, the Theranos employee, Tyler Schultz, and how it really ripped them apart because they didn't know who to trust. Because George Schultz, who we all know is a former Secretary of State, great man in American history, and big-time investor, trusted Elizabeth over the words of his own son, and that caused a big rift. And so the middleman in all this, Tyler's father, was quite broken up about this, and he clearly blames Elizabeth Holmes.
The interesting thing is that, why should we believe a kid who's telling us that it's not working, yet people believed a kid saying that it was going to work?
It's a very good point. I mean, we believe young people here in Silicon Valley. We give them hundreds of millions of dollars to do what they do. In this case, it almost should have been a warning that Elizabeth Holmes investors were not young people with tech experience, but they were, let's say it, men of a certain age, without tech experience, but with political experience and with influence and with connections. But really, it says something that biotech investors and venture capitalists from Silicon Valley stayed away from Theranos, and that should have been a big warning to people who either went to work or went to invest in the company.
Remember, of course, Holmes was convicted about some business dealings related to this failed blood testing startup, found guilty of cheating investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars with false claims about Theranos' technology and business dealings. Those false claims helped Theranos raise something like $945 million from investors. Nearly $1 billion was raised off stuff that was ultimately found to not be true. It's because there was this promise of a medical revolution in blood testing that catapulted the company to $10 billion in value, but the tech was never there. It just never worked. the way that Holmes and others promised that it would. Now, Ella Charles is joining us now. So let me get into the nitty-gritty of this sentencing. I believe, and I'm just checking my notes here, prosecutors had asked for 15 years in prison. The defense had said no prison time, just home confinement. The judge ended up saying 11 and a half years behind bars, right? I mean, this is a significant sentence, and it largely tracks with what we've seen for defendants convicted of similar crimes, which is like roughly 16 years, according to some reports.
Right, Hallie. This is very significant because it is rare for people like Elizabeth Holmes to be charged for fraud, let alone convicted of it. So at this point, the judge now saying she'll be serving 11 and a half years in prison. Her defense tried so hard for this not to be the case. They've been arguing that she should serve no prison time because they say her intentions were good. This week, they submitted more than 100 letters from her family, her friends, and supporters saying that she did not mean for this to happen. In that included a letter from her husband who described her as being selfless and loving and described her as a loving partner and also a great mother. There was also a letter from Senator Cory Booker who says that he is hopeful that she will continue to make the world a better place. So those are the letters that were submitted from her defense in support of her not getting any prison time here and getting a lenient sentence, Hallie, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Prosecutors, of course, on the other end of that spectrum, although there was a max here of 20 years, they recommended 15 years, saying not only was she the face of Theranos, but she was also the mastermind of deception and lies. They say that this is one of the worst crimes when it comes to white-collar crime in the history of Silicon Valley. So this is also sending a strong message to Silicon Valley as well, because those entrepreneurs are known to work in different situations in which they basically fake it until they make it. But in this case, Theranos did not make it. Elizabeth Holmes' technology never was found to work in the way she said it would. She, of course, got famous off of the idea that with just one drop of blood, that she could give hundreds of blood tests, changing the way we see healthcare, right? Instead of having a painful process in which you have a vial of blood, instead getting it in a painless situation in which you just have one drop, like a prick. So it's huge. This is a huge message that's being sent, Hallie.
What I think is also important to remember here context-wise is what a huge star she was, a darling of the tech and medical industries. She was on the cover of magazines. She became a celebrity because of this. She pulled in incredibly high-profile people who were investing in her company, you know, former cabinet officials in various administrations, right? Like we were showing some pictures of her. She was known for like wearing the black turtleneck like Steve Jobs everywhere. She had kind of a look. She very, very high profile. And no one even now is not, like the judge in his sentencing statement said, you know, this is sad because Ms. Holmes is brilliant, he said. But he said this is troubling on so many levels. What went wrong? I mean, that's the thing about it here. She has said, as you have noted, that she says she regrets her failings with every cell of her body, you know, and yet here she is convicted and heading to prison behind bars for maybe a decade. But I mean, a decade plus, by the way. Like, that's not saying who knows what happens with parole.
Yeah, Hallie, she had a meteoric rise, right? She's now 38 years old, but she started this company when she was 19. In 2014, Forbes named her the youngest female self-made billionaire ever. So this is huge. You mentioned the fact that she raised more than $900 million in funding from important people. You had former Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. She invested $100 million in this company. And there's also former Secretary of States who invested a lot of money in this as well. And it's important to note here that a lot has changed since she started this company. She came into the courtroom today visibly very pregnant. She has a 1-year-old son at home. And based on the information we have, the judge says she has to start that prison sentence April 25th.
She's got a baby on the way.
27th. Too. She has a baby on the way. So based on just what we saw today in the courtroom, it appears she's very pregnant and most likely she'll have that baby prior to serving her sentence. But now she has to deal with the reality that she's going to be missing out a lot of important moments and years of her children's lives. Hallie?
company.
And that's why it's so powerful to have you in the courtroom, because you have been following tech and you know that not everybody was throwing money at her.
No, there were a lot of people, especially female executives in Silicon Valley, who were very angry by this, that wait a minute, she's committing fraud. She is doing to us reputational harm. There were a lot of venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who over the last year and a half told me this is what we were staying away from. You can observe a young person who drops out of college to do something, but until they deliver anything, it's very risky to put money there, especially the biotech VCs who said we just didn't see any results coming from Theranos from the get-go, and that's why they refused to invest in her company.
I thought it was powerful that the judge also said, the sad thing is that she is quite brilliant. I mean, maybe she could have done something different.
The judge did say that, and I think even those who were testifying against her didn't testify against her to say you had no idea what to do with our money. What they said was you were doing the wrong things with our money. You knew that what you were doing was wrong and you kept on doing it. A lot of people who observed this trial told me what they could not forgive was not taking large money from investors, but putting those machines in Walgreens knowing that they were inaccurate, and what that did to many patients.
And we've seen a lot of people showing up, members of the public and perhaps other investors, because they wanted to see what happened. She wasn't convicted of defrauding them, though, but they still felt defrauded.
They did, and I think the judge even touched on that. There's a culture here in Silicon Valley where we want young people to do well, and we feel betrayed when they betray our trust. And so there are many reasons you can say why this case became such an international sensation. She's a young woman. She was attractive. She was very smart. Dropping out of Stanford to start a company, it's very audacious. Getting all this investor money, it all comes together. Also, let's face it, people like to sometimes see someone taken down a peg or two, as she and Theranos were. So this case had it all. But yeah, I think a lot of people did feel betrayed, because this is, for a while, what Silicon Valley gave its attention to. And unlike many of the other companies and inventions and innovations, this one didn't pan out.
Yeah. We heard a lot about her pregnancy, people saying whatever about it. Did she do it on purpose? Did she try to get sympathy? Whatever. We know that the judge said you can stay seated if you want because you're pregnant. Did it play in any other way, you think?
As far as the decision, I don't think so, except I'm guessing that her surrender date will be into next year so that she can have the child and spend some time with it. But an 11.25-year sentence when you have an infant and what will be a one or 2 year old is very significant to any parent. And so you've got to think that that didn't come into play all that much. It was less than what the prosecution wanted. They asked for 15 years, but it was much more than what her side asked for.
And it was more than what the probation board recommended. What did the judge say about that?
It's a very good point. He said he took that 9 years into account. And a matter of fact, fairly early in what he was saying, he said, I always take very seriously what the probation board says. So a lot of us were sitting, whoa, is this going to be a 9-year sentence? And that's what made the end a little more surprising, is that even after taking the 9-year recommendation into account and saying how much faith he put into that, he added more than 2 years to the sentence.
So 11 years and 3 months at a later date. We're going to find out today what that surrender date is?
Yeah, I think it's mid-year. I can check right now. Everything's been tweeting back and forth. I just ran downstairs to talk to you. But yes, I do know it's months into the future. April, thank you. It's April 27. And so thank you. We do know it's April 27. So if you do the math, that gives some time. Not a whole lot of time. I mean, we've had children, but it gives some time. And then from there, it's obviously going to be tough.
It is more time than some women get with their babies.
Yes,
right?
Indeed. And then that will.
So what happens next?
What happens next is, we hear, I think, from both sides. It's interesting that both sides of this trial, and probably after the Holmes trial, declined to speak because they had another one coming right up with Sunny Balwani, also from Theranos, and Elizabeth Holmes' attorneys haven't talked, and I have a feeling that they knew their strategy was going to be to pull this, drag this out for a long time with various attempts to either have a new trial or reject this one. Now that all that has passed, I imagine we'll be hearing from both sides now on what they hope to see. And as for Holmes herself, I mean, it's getting ready for a long stretch.
Right. And I think a lot of people did want to hear from her. We're not allowed to take cameras into a federal courtroom. So, all the words that we have from her are from you and written. Is there anything that you think she could say to the public that would change? I mean, there's nothing to change here, right? But would there be any reason for her to speak publicly?
I mean, this is exactly half a lifetime ago for her, right? And so for her to say, I'm sorry, for her to say, I feel terrible about how this turned out, at the time,